Hi, it's Alex Cosper for SacTV.com's Riverside Chat here at the American River, home of the California Gold Rush. And I have another very interesting gold rush story for you today. It involves the music industry, which issues gold and platinum records, or has since the late 50s, and now it's possible to get those awards through streaming, but at one time it had to do with a number of albums or singles sold to retail outlets. So the Moody Blues, one of the most influential bands in rock history, is the topic for today's Riverside Chat, because one of their founding members, Mike Pinder, passed away at the end of April 2024, and he actually lived near Sacramento, about 50 miles northeast of Sacramento in Grass Valley. What's interesting about that is Grass Valley and Nevada City, they're like neighboring communities. They are rich in gold mining history, and in fact, that little region produced the greatest amount of gold during the California Gold Rush and afterward. So they mined like $400 million worth of gold from the 1850s to the 1950s in that region, Grass Valley / Nevada City. And keep in mind, Nevada City was a community before the state of Nevada became part of the United States. In fact, the name Nevada, which means snow-covered, was applied to Nevada City before the name Nevada was applied to the state of Nevada, which joined the Union in the 1860s, a decade after California. But the reason why I'm talking about the Moody Blues is because Mike Pinder lived in Grass Valley, and that's where he died at the age of 82 at his home. And it's interesting that someone who achieved so much in the music industry wound up in that small town, but a very communal town. Nevada City is the home of KVMR, an incredible community-supported radio station, and that's been a legendary station for decades now. But something tells me he was probably on that station, but that's one of the best stations in America as far as, say, you're an indie artist and want to get your music played. That just has a very loyal audience that wants to hear new music. And so it's just interesting that Mike Pinder chose to move from the UK to the United States, and the place where he wound up was Grass Valley. So I think the reason people go there, the main reason, is it's just a peaceful artistic community. There's just a lot of good vibes there, and it's a great place to be, even if you're not a musician, but especially if you're a musician, because it just has this very artistic ideology that goes along with that community. Now, Grass Valley I've been there many times. I used to do high school dances there as a DJ. I did DJ work all over, but I never knew that Mike Pinder lived there until he died, and they wrote about it in the press. So that's interesting that he was able to kind of have anonymity and not make a big deal out of being such a very influential rock musician. because he's the guy who introduced John Lennon to a very super important electronic keyboard instrument in the 1960s, before synthesizers. And that instrument was called the Mellotron, because Mike Pinder, one of his early jobs was technical work at a shop that made the Mellotron, which is like a analog-based keyboard before the digital age of synthesizers. So what I mean by that is they use samples. Each key on the keyboard hit a sound sample, but that was not a digital loop, it was an analog loop. In other words, it was tape, physical tape that played when you hit the key, like a little tape recorder would hit the sound of that note. And you had to press hard for the note to sustain, but it had a really nice full sound to it. And that sound can be heard on the Beatles hit Strawberry Fields Forever. That keyboard sound on Nights in White Satin. And then at the end there's this poem narrated by Mike Pinder. So that's one of the rare times you heard his voice distinctly with the Moody Blues, who had different lead singers, like started off with Denny Lane, who ended up in Paul McCartney and Wings. He had the hit Go Now in 1964, which was an R&B cover. The next lead singer they got was chosen by Mike Pinder. He was very influential in bringing Justin Hayward to the Moody Blues as the lead singer. And then from then on, they just started having million-selling albums, like all the time. Like most of their albums either went gold or platinum. And so the song Nights in White Satin originally came out on the album Days of Future Past in 1967. And then that song was too long to be a single at that time. So, but it did come out 5 years later in 1972, reissued as a shorter version without the poem. And that version was a big hit in the United States. So from then on, they just started having these big selling albums. And Mike Pinder stayed with the Moody Blues until their late 70s album Octave, 1978, that had the hit single Steppin' in a Slide Zone. I should say the rock hit single, because it was mainly a hit on rock stations, not really pop stations. By then, the radio formats began to get segmented so that each station was its own unique format that often was a subset of a broader format. So like rock, started fragmenting into, album-oriented rock, adult rock, and mellow rock. There were others, soft rock. Just different forms of rock started to emerge. And you could call top 40 like pop rock, because it still had a lot of rock in it in the 70s. And the Moody Blues still had top 40 hits through the 80s, even after Mike Pinder left. But Mike Pinder still played the Mellotron on their 1978 album Octave. And then he left the Moody Blues. And after that, you heard hits that were more synthesizer based by the Moody Blues, such as The Voice on the Long Distance Voyager album of 1981. And later on, Your Wildest Dreams, 1986, was a great tune, great pop rock tune that came from the album The Other Side of Life. And that year they came to Sacramento. They played at Arco Arena. They also played at Arco in 1994. And then again, 2007, they played at the Memorial Auditorium. And they played in Sacramento at least one other time, and that was in 1969 at Cal Expo with Country Joe and the Fish. So if you have tickets to any of these shows, ticket stubs, that's great memorabilia, you know, that I think matters to a lot of rock fans of the 60s and 70s. I'm a rock fan. That's why I hang out at the river, because I'm surrounded by cool rocks. Moody Blues, their type of rock, some called it progressive rock. Some called it, well, later on, synth rock. Some called it classical rock, because they did mix classical sounds with their music. And it had that effect from the Mellotron. So the Mellotron lasted from the early 60s through the late 70s. It began to dissolve from pop music by the late 70s, when more elaborate synthesizers came on the scene. Synthesizers like the Moog synthesizer started appearing in the mid to late 60s. The Doors used it. It just became the staple sound of like orchestral rock or even progressive rock. And by the 80s, of course, you had digital synthesizers. So that's how Mike Pinder played an important role in music history. Partly by influencing the Moody Blues in several ways, and they themselves influenced a lot of bands to want to mix classical sounds with rock, but also because Mike Pinder introduced John Lennon to the Mellotron, and then John Lennon used it on Strawberry Fields Forever, and it appeared on other Beatles songs as well. My friend, local artist Ken Koenig, who does a lot of cover songs from the 60s and 70s and 80s and 90s, plus originals, he got to meet Mike Pinder at some point this century, and I want to interview Ken about that, what their discussion was. He says he has a funny story about how Mike introduced John Lennon to the Mellotron. So that's it for now, for another Riverside chat. Talking golden memories, golden oldies, golden platinum albums from the Moody Blues, who weren't that far from Sacramento. And they definitely are part of Sacramento history. What's ironic is I saw them in 1986 in the San Francisco Bay Area, even though they had come to Sacramento on that same tour. So I never saw them in Sacramento, but I did get to see them in the Bay Area, and that was one of the best concerts I've ever seen or heard.